The young and the restless spoilers in the quiet aftershock of Damien's sudden and brutal death, Genoa City had begun to stir once more with secrets long buried and resentments never quite healed. Among them, none festered more dangerously than those of Holden. For most, Holden was barely a blip on the radar, a drifter, a shadow of a man who had come and gone with little consequence. But to those who paid close attention, he was far more. He had slipped into town with a calculated charm, playing the role of Amy's long-lost son with such conviction that even she, weary and wounded by her own past, allowed herself to believe. Their reunion, brief as it was, became a strange comfort for Amy, who had endured the unbearable loss of her real son Damien. At first, the arrangement seemed innocent, perhaps even healing. Amy was fragile, and Holden provided a strange balm. They laughed over old stories that Holden had obviously studied, shared meals in silence heavy with unspoken truths, and sat side by side in the garden as if time itself had conspired to give them one final chance. But beneath Holden's practiced exterior simmered a hatred that knew no bounds. Damien's mere existence had ruined him, had exposed a truth he had tried to bury for years. And though Damien had never sought to harm Holden directly, his arrival had lit a match that turned Holden's carefully constructed life into a wildfire of disgrace. Nate had been the first to unravel Holden's mask, calling out the deception with evidence too concrete to deny. The confrontation had been swift and merciless, with Nate refusing to allow Holden's charade to continue, and the fallout left Holden humiliated, exposed, and consumed by a need for revenge. It wasn't just anger that drove him, it was the loss of control, the collapse of identity, and the bitter realization that Damien, without even knowing it, had stolen something Holden could never reclaim. And now Damien was dead. Stabbed. Left bleeding in a place once thought to be safe. It didn't take long for whispers to circulate that the list of people with motive to kill him was long. But for Amy, now standing alone in the French coastal city of Nice, the grief had turned quickly into suspicion. Her eyes no longer brimmed only with sorrow, they burned with purpose. Damien had enemies, yes, but only one of them had recently posed as her son and disappeared the moment Damien's body hit the floor. Amy had traveled to Nice not to mourn, but to hunt. She was sharper than most gave her credit for, and her pain did not dull her instincts, it sharpened them like a blade. She compiled a list in a worn notebook, naming each person who had once tried to sabotage Damien, however subtly. At the top of the list, underlined twice, was Holden. While others speculated about Kane, Nick, or even Audra, Amy focused on what others overlooked. Holden had motive, and more importantly, he had vanished just before everything fell apart. That wasn't coincidence, it was calculated. And Amy was done being manipulated. In an act fueled by desperation and fury, she broke into Holden's temporary rental near the cliffs of Nice. It was a modest place, tucked behind an overgrown path, barely lived in but still humming with presence. Amy entered without hesitation, her hands trembling but steady enough to twist the lock. Inside, the air was stale, the curtains drawn, the place reeking of secrecy. What she found shattered what little faith she had left in redemption. Inside a locked drawer beneath the false bottom of a wooden chest, she discovered folders, photographs of Damien marked with circles and notes, copies of surveillance footage from the estate in Nice, including timestamps from the night Damien died. And then, more damning than anything, a small black notebook with Holden's handwriting detailing his observations of Damien's routines, weaknesses, patterns. It wasn't just a plan, it was an obsession. On one page, Damien's name was written over and over again, each time in a darker stroke, as if Holden were trying to write him out of existence. There were drafts of letters addressed to Amy, some tender, others manic and scrawled with bitterness. One letter ended abruptly with the words, "He took everything from me. He made me nothing." In the closet, Amy found a jacket with what looked like dried blood on the cuff, and in the trash bin beneath the kitchen sink, fragments of a burned photograph, one that once showed Amy, Damien, and Holden standing together in the park. Amy fell to the floor as the truth washed over her. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't grief inventing monsters. This was real. Holden had stalked Damien, documented him, hated him. And now Damien was dead. The evidence didn't scream confession, but it whispered of a man unraveling, and Amy knew those whispers would soon roar. Back in Genoa City, others had begun to forget about Holden, their focus splintered between more obvious suspects. Kane continued to protest his innocence, Nick was being cornered, and Phyllis had her own motives buried beneath layers of loyalty and betrayal. But Amy's discovery would change everything. She didn't go to the police, not yet. She needed to know more. She needed Holden to face her, to see the mother of the man he may have murdered stare directly into the broken shell of who he had become. But Holden was gone. Vanished. His rental abandoned within hours of Amy's break-in. And still, the notebook he left behind told a story even in his absence. Damien had been more than just a rival to Holden. He was a symbol of everything Holden couldn't be. And that kind of resentment didn't fade, it metastasized. Amy returned to the city, notebook in hand, and began planting the seeds of doubt in the minds of others. She spoke to Nate in hushed tones. She sent word to Victor, who had the power and reach to trace Holden across continents. She cornered Phyllis and asked pointed questions about who knew what and when. And soon, the narrative began to shift. Holden, once thought to be irrelevant, began to haunt the investigation like a ghost returned to claim justice or vengeance, depending on the lens through which you looked. Still, the path forward was dangerous. If Holden had killed once, he could kill again, especially if he knew Amy was coming for him. The director's decision to keep Holden out of sight in the current episodes was no accident. It was a slow burn, a trap being set. The writers knew that when he returned, it would not be with an apology or a whimper. It would be with a reckoning. Amy, for all her grief, was becoming more than just a grieving mother. She was evolving into a hunter with nothing left to lose. Her calm demeanor belied a fury that would not be quenched until she had answers, or revenge. And somewhere, in a dark corner of the world, Holden was watching. Waiting. Planning. Because in his twisted mind, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Under the suffocating heat of the Mediterranean coast, the narrow streets of Nice whispered secrets that even the sea could not wash away. Inside a dimly lit villa tucked behind ivy-covered walls, the ghost of Damien lingered, not in form, but in the dread that haunted Holden's every breath. Holden had built his world on deception, on resentment, on the twisted belief that if he could just destroy what Damien represented, he could reclaim his sense of identity. But now that fantasy had crumbled. Amy had broken into his sanctum, shattered his illusion of control, and uncovered truths he had hidden with surgical precision. And she hadn't done it quietly. No, she had moved like a force of nature, pulling open drawers, peeling back the layers of his false life until only the rot remained. Holden had been there, hidden, paralyzed, watching through the sliver of a cracked door as Amy's trembling hands uncovered the notebooks, the photos, the obsessive records. His heart beat like a war drum in his chest. Every instinct screamed to run, but he stayed frozen, soaked in cold sweat, gripped by the terror of being seen, not just physically, but completely, for who he truly was. In that moment, Holden saw something far more frightening than exposure. He saw consequence. He saw a future collapsing under the weight of the past. Everything he had done. Pretending to be Amy's son, fueling a campaign of hatred against Damien, tracking every move with a cold, methodical rage, was now being exhumed by the one person who should have never known. Amy was no longer grieving. She was resolute. And that resolve made her dangerous. She hadn't run to the authorities immediately, which meant she was plotting. And Holden knew what happened when someone plotted against him, he lost. He had already lost once when Nate ripped his mask away in Genoa City, exposing his lies. He couldn't afford to lose again. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. As the villa fell into eerie silence after Amy's departure, Holden stepped into the ruined room like a man emerging from a grave. The notebooks still lay where she had left them, the closet door ajar, the scent of her perfume clinging to the air. He reached for the burned photograph, now crumpled and partially torn, and stared at the last memory they all shared, a lie captured in color. He crushed it in his fist, and with it, the last sliver of delusion that he could make things right. Now, there was only survival. And survival demanded sacrifice. But what kind? That was the question that devoured him from within. Holden paced the dark hallway like a man haunted by his own heartbeat. He replayed every possibility. If Amy turned him in, the evidence was damning. Obsession. Motive. Proximity. Disguise. He wouldn't just be accused, he would be convicted. And the worst part? He couldn't even say he was innocent. Because even if he didn't plunge the knife into Damien's chest, he had wanted it. Fantasized about it. Planned for it in the deepest, darkest corners of his mind. That level of hatred, well documented in his journals, was as good as guilt. And Amy had it all. A whisper began to stir in the back of Holden's mind. A solution. A permanent one. If Amy disappeared, so would the threat. No testimony. No evidence. No reckoning. But the thought, while tempting, came with a scream from his conscience that he could barely suppress. He wasn't a killer. He had lied, manipulated, even betrayed, but murder? That was another chasm altogether. A place from which there was no return. Yet fear has a way of distorting morality, and Holden's fear was absolute. It gripped his throat, dulled his reason, and began planting seeds of desperation in the soil of paranoia. He envisioned scenarios where Amy went to the police the very next day, where Nate and Victor would drag him back to Genoa City in chains, where he would rot in a cell while the world painted him as a madman and a murderer. The weight of that image pressed down on him until breathing felt like swallowing glass. Still, something deeper pushed back. A last vestige of humanity that pleaded with him to stop. To run. To disappear. There were other ways, weren't there? Holden could vanish for good. Change his name again, cross a border, burn what remained of Damien's ghost and start over. Wasn't that what he always did when cornered? But this time, something was different. This wasn't just about escaping judgment. This was about Amy. The one woman who, for a fleeting moment, had made him feel like he mattered. She had looked at him not as a pawn, or a threat, but as a lost boy pretending to be a son. And even when she knew the truth, some part of her hadn't hated him. That kind of grace was rare. And now, because of his own spiral, she was a target in his mind. That realization made him sick. Holden collapsed into the chair beside the window and buried his face in his hands. He wanted to scream, to break something, to rip his mind in half just to find a sliver of peace. But the truth was clear. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the next step would either end everything or redeem something. He could not undo the past. Damien was gone. The lies had been told. The hatred had poisoned too much already. But Holden wasn't sure he had it in him to become the monster the world already believed him to be. His phone buzzed once on the table, and he stared at it as though it had sprouted claws. A message from a blocked number. Likely Amy. Or someone working for her. The text read simply, "We need to talk. I know more than you think." Holden stared at the screen for a long time, then deleted the message. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. The words rattled in his skull like a bell tolling for a final choice. In the end, the question wasn't whether Holden could kill. The question was whether he could stop the part of himself that wanted to. And as the lights in the villa flickered and the night crept deeper into the walls, Holden sat alone, hands trembling, knowing that one more wrong move would plunge him into darkness no lie could ever disguise. He had a chance, one last chance, to flee, to confess, to confront Amy not with a weapon, but with the truth. But would he take it? Or would fear drive him into the irreversible? Only time would tell. But for now, Holden remained the most dangerous kind of man. One with nothing left to lose, and just enough conscience to regret whatever came next.